Hi, everyone. I am De'Ara, the host of the All Kinds of Minds podcast. I represent Social Cipher, an edtech company that makes social and emotional learning games for neurodivergent students. And today we have a very special guest, a clinical psychologist and published author, Dr. Lucas Harrington. So, Dr. Harrington, can you please just tell us about your experience and, just a little bit about yourself?
All right. Thanks, Jira. Thanks for having me on. So, first off, right off the bat, I am autistic myself, and I was raised as a girl. I'm transgender. So in some ways, my experience is going to be different from autistic women. And in some ways, it's going to be very similar. And then professionally, I've done just a lot of autism assessments. For a lot of my career, diagnostic assessment was a big part of what I was doing. So a lot of girls, a lot of women, a lot of, gender diverse people, but assigned female at birth, raised as a girl and everything. So just seeing all kinds of different people. The book that I've published that I'm co-author for is actually, assessment of autism in females and nuanced presentations, because like we're going to be talking about today, you often see some more complexity with some of those people than kind of what we think of for a standard autism diagnosis. And then nowadays, I'm really doing a lot of therapy, a lot of treatment. Mostly what I do is parent coaching, family therapy. And so there might be an autistic daughter a lot of the times, and then a lot of times because it is a genetic condition, we often the mom is going to be autistic as well. So just working with people, working with autistic girls and women in just all kinds of different contexts.
Quick question about that before we get into our questions. But you said that the mom tends to be autistic as well. Have you noticed that they might be like late diagnosed or anything like that? A lot of the moms.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily say that they tend to be. I don't know the stats offhand. But it is fairly common. And yeah, very, very few of the families come into me with a parent having an autism diagnosis. So some of the families, like, they go and they get a diagnosis. Some of the families, we suspect it, but it's just not necessarily worth their time and energy to go and get the formal diagnosis when there's really not that many services available for adults, unfortunately.
Mhm.
So, but, it's helpful for them just to understand about themselves and to know that they are.
Right. Okay, so why do you think that autism is often overlooked or misdiagnosed in girls?
I think there's a lot of different reasons for it. Some of it is going to be biological, just with presenting a little bit differently. A lot of it is going to be socialization. At this point, we don't really have a good understanding of how much is with, like, for the biological side, we know, like, even with little babies, autistic girls, tend to look at faces more often than the autistic boys. On average, everything I talk about is averages. There's going to be, people who are different, but it looks like there might be some kind of just innate neurological differences in that how this happened. And then socialization wise, there's a huge difference where girls or people who are being raised as girls are often under way more pressure to, be very aware of what other people are thinking and feeling, social norms, what's expected of you. When I do see actually, like, I know some autistic people where they're not girls, but they have some of these similar traits, and they were raised as boys. So kind of in general, they didn't necessarily get that same socialization, but they came from a family where just the family put a really high value on that. And so they were also getting a lot of that very intensive coaching on, like, oh, didn't you notice, like, your aunt wanted you to do this? Like, let's take care of these people's feelings. They're getting some of that same coaching. So I do think that the socialization plays a role in just some of the behaviors and outcomes looking differently. And then another thing that you see is where they might actually be not looking different from how the boys are behaving, but people just aren't expecting to see it there. Like, um, there's been research on showing that it looks like when you have a girl and a boy who have the same traits, the boy is more likely to get a diagnosis, possibly just because people are expecting to see that more. Whereas with girls, they might come up with a different explanation, like, oh, she's just shy, she's just sensitive. Some of these things that we that we think of as more typical in girls that stand out as more of a concern with boys. And then girls also with the autism and also with some other things like ADHD, you might see where they are less disruptive. Like with the ADHD, you see, the boys a lot of them are often hyperactive. They're causing a lot of trouble. And so they get flagged, they get evaluated and everything. The girl might just kind of be flying under the radar where people aren't noticing that she's struggling. And then I think some of the same thing with autism.
That's so interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. I taught for 4 years, and I would say in each class, so in a school year, I would teach 6 different classes. And so in each class, I would have like 2 or 3 autistic students. I cannot remember having any diagnosed autistic girls.
Yeah. Yeah. When were you teaching?
hmm I can't remember having any autistic girls. I had a few um, girls with ADHD, but as far as like being diagnosed and having IEPs, I don't remember having any autistic girls. And I think that's really interesting because, with that being the case from my experience, it's not like there weren't any. It's highly unlikely that there weren't any. It's just that they weren't diagnosed. And they probably would have been less likely to be noticed because it just appears as though it's all boys. That's how it looked in my classroom. And I'm definitely curious. Well, if it's often misdiagnosed and overlooked, it probably is the same kind of experience in other classrooms where the boys get that attention more. So
Yeah.
what are some of those traits that are common but overlooked in girls?
So one that I talk about a lot is that the intense, autism, you've got those intense interests that's very common. And sometimes they're really unusual interests. Like for some reason, like vacuum cleaners are one of the popular ones with autistic kids. I always say, like, if a kid is passionate about a particular brand of vacuum cleaner, like doesn't necessarily prove it, but that's definitely going to get my attention. And with girls, a lot of times you might be, and again, everything I say is generalization. You see
Right.
this with other genders as well. But more often with girls, you might see where they're interested in something that is actually very typical for girls. So like they're super into Disney princesses. They're super into horses. And so people are like, well, she's just a horse girl. It's normal for girls to be obsessed with horses. But she's into it kind of in a different way than the other girls are. Either like she's so into it that, even the other girls who like it are tired of hearing her talk about it. Or she's like really into kind of the esoteric details. Like for me, when I was growing up, I was super into virtual pets, which was very, very common interest in, growing up in the 90s. That's very normal. I was also really into, like, I was learning how to open up like the database software and like making spreadsheets of my virtual pets. And that was significantly less typical, I would say. So that kind of, getting really into the details that even other people who share the interest might find boring, or that kind of like cataloging, systemizing, like they talk about sometimes with Barbies. You get girls where people are like, oh, well, of course she has a million Barbies. Girls love Barbies. But she's, maybe not doing the storylines, or not doing it as much as the other girls, or not playing together with other girls. She's like arranging them and looking at them, or like color coding them, just doing something different with that interest.
So it sounds like the parents really need to be the ones like paying attention and need to be knowledgeable about these overlooked traits.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of times. Yeah. And then at school, it can be tough to notice because with a certain kind of autism presentation that people are more accustomed to, you see where just they look really lonely. They're sitting by themselves at lunch, or they're trying to engage, and the other kids are like telling them, you can't play with me or something. Whereas the research talks about a lot of times you'll see a girl where she's kind of like hovering around the edges of a group, and she's not getting chased off. Like they're letting her be there. They're maybe engaging with her a little bit, but she's not really included. And she's just bouncing from one to another. And so it looks like, she's very socially engaged. She has all these friends, but she might not actually be really connecting with any of them.
Yeah. No, I can definitely think of students who fit that criteria when you say it like that. So how would you say that masking and camouflaging behaviors manifest in autistic girls? You kind of touched on it a little bit as far as like um, like the socialization piece, but just in general, like what have you noticed as a difference between how girls commonly mask and camouflage versus boys?
Um, I would say um, something that I say sometimes with I I especially being autistic, the need for precision. I'm always going to re-emphasize stereotypes. There's exceptions, but generally, like the people I assess tend to fall into kind of one of two categories. I'm like, there's the like anxious overthinkers who have like planned out and figured out everything, and then there's the live in the moment types. And girls, I think, are often more likely to be the ones who are really like studying what is it that people want from me, maybe like, practicing facial expressions in the mirror to try to get that right, picking up a persona from a character in a book or from another person that they think is doing well with that. Whereas, one thing actually that's funny is that I think people often assume because I'm high achieving and everything, they look at me and they go, "Oh, like I bet you were one of those high camouflaging children." And I definitely was not. Like I wanted to stop. I wanted to stop being bullied. I didn't want to be completely alone. But I also didn't have very much concern for like, do people think I'm normal? Do people think I'm fitting in? I was much more focused on doing my own thing. My mind was on my interests, not on studying these things, especially when I was a little kid. And I feel like that's the pattern that I think is more common with a lot of boys, especially when they're younger. Although as you get older and as kind of the punishments for being different get severe, then I think autistic people in general, all of them tend to start thinking more about, okay, what am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah. So, were you diagnosed later on in life?
I was officially diagnosed. I think I was almost 30 when I
Oh,
was
wow.
officially diagnosed. Um, it was really apparent when I was like junior high or high school. I was at a private school. I didn't need like the formal special ed services. And so I think maybe there just wasn't that much to be gained from going through the full the full formal diagnostic process. But that actually did lead to there being a bit of a dip that I sometimes talk about where like when I was in junior high or high school, it was very obvious. We were very clear that I was. And then, I went to college. I went to grad school. I was doing really well professionally. Like I was married. I had a lot of friends and everything. And so I did go through a phase of like, oh, did we make a mistake? Like, am I not autistic? Because we thought, at the time I was still thinking, oh, autistic people couldn't do those things. And then a friend of mine who was a woman got diagnosed, and I started learning about some of these more subtle presentations. And I was like, oh, yeah, no, that's me exactly. And so then I got the formal diagnosis. But I was missed the first time around. The person was saying the stereotypes like, oh, no, you can't be autistic because you show emotion and, you have empathy and all of those things that are just not accurate. I mean, I do have those traits.
No,
It's
I
not
get
accurate that that means you
it.
can't be autistic.
Yeah, it's kind of like this very outdated mentality of what an autistic person is like, and thinking like, oh well, they don't have empathy. And like how you're saying, like you like to always say in general,
Yeah.
not, all. They tend to, not they, but people who have that outdated mentality tend to feel like, oh, well, if you don't fit into this specific box, then you are not autistic.
Yeah. And even just looking at the norm, there's been a lot of research now on autistic empathy. And what they found is on average, like autistic people care just as much as anybody else. That's called effective empathy, like how much you care and how much you feel for other people. What we have difficulty with is what they call the cognitive empathy, like understanding what is someone else thinking, especially neurotypical people. A new branch of exploration right now is finding, oh, autistic people we actually are often pretty good at taking each other's perspectives, sometimes better than the neurotypicals are. But, understanding when like 97% of the world is thinking very differently from you, then it can be hard to figure out what's going on here.
Yeah. Honestly, I think a lot of that is with neurotypical people in general, not being as direct in saying, this is what I mean, this is how I feel, just not being as direct. So it's kind of like, okay, well, is this really what they meant? Is this really how they feel? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and you can speak from your experience or just from all of the different families that you've worked with, but how can these overlooked traits impact a girl's experience in school?
So, you know, possibly a majority of the kids that I work with have some kind of school avoidance where they're not wanting to go to school. They're, very anxious about going to school. They're often, pretty burned out trying to keep up with the expectations. And because of that masking, because of that camouflaging, a lot of times the school might think it's the parents' fault. And because they're like, well, the kid, she's fine when she's at school. Like if she's acting up at home, then obviously it's something that you're doing. Whereas for a lot of kids, especially, the girls who might feel, some of these girls who might feel pressured to like, be a good girl and do what people want her to do and not make waves and everything. Like she might be really bottling it up at school, just pushing through, oh, it's too loud in here. It's overwhelming. I don't understand what's happening. I'm not actually having any fun at recess or at lunch, but she's really holding it together at school. And then she gets home and that's her safe place. And so that's where it's all coming out. And then the next morning, like she is not wanting to go back to do that all over again, quite understandably.
So when that happens, that school avoidance, how do you recommend that the school and the parents address that?
Generally, a lot of that is going to be about making the school feel like a safer place for the girl, making it so that it's not taking so much out of her. So things like the sensory supports, she can use the earphones or she can take a break to go be by herself, having safe people that she can connect to. There's also, there's a component of teaching some coping strategies for managing the anxiety and everything. But a lot of times, the girl is way too overwhelmed for that to make much of a dent in it. We need to help her kind of start off at a good place and then build those things in there so that she has the strategies to deal with kind of the more manageable, typical stress level.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when you're feeling overwhelmed, that's not the time where you're really thinking like, okay, well, what is the 5 steps to, you know,
Yeah.
yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. So,
Yeah. And
oh, go ahead.
I'll just add in, also addressing things like bullying. There also might be undiagnosed learning issues, ADHD, like dyslexia, learning disabilities, those kinds of things. And then also providing more social support. So she might need like a lunch fund type thing so that she has something that she can enjoy at lunchtime instead of that just being a time that like reinforces that nobody wants to sit with her. Just, the always thinking about what can we do to make this feel like a safer and more welcoming place that she might actually like to be and not send her into that fight or flight that just turns your brain into soup and makes it virtually impossible to learn.
Yeah, but not just saying like, well, this is what it is, so you're gonna have to adapt, which unfortunately is how some people are, treated,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So, as you know, being autistic doesn't start with when you get that diagnosis. So when there are teachers like how I was who have undiagnosed autistic girls or autistic students in general, what can they do to make sure their classroom is inclusive, considering these kids don't have an IEP or, anything outlining anything outlining exactly what accommodations and supports they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is a very high need. One, I guess, would be about just making it kind of generally welcoming, having an attitude of like, we value and celebrate differences here, whether that is cultural differences, neurological differences, that, all of these things are, it's great that we're different and we all have something to contribute. And then, like one of the things when I present to employers, one of the things I talk about is like, if you're other employees are feeling jealous of the accommodations the autistic employees are getting, then like you're not taking good enough care of the needs of your other employees. Because there's all sorts of reasons that have just nothing to do with a diagnosable condition, why somebody might need flexibility and accommodation, understanding. Looking at kids, like maybe even kids without diagnoses, maybe they're getting bullied. Maybe they are, having to take care of siblings at home. They're not getting enough sleep because they're working job to support their family, all of these stressors. And just so having a general environment of like, we believe that you're trying to do your best. And if you're not meeting expectations, this ties into, Ross Green and all of his collaborative and proactive solutions, just really brilliant. That's, I think one of the best tools for schools, but just really taking this attitude of like, we believe you're trying your best and that you have a good reason for kind of taking the approach that you're doing. And if what you're doing is not working out for us or not working out for you, then we're going to work together to figure out like something that can work better. And so things like, having sensory supports that are available to everybody. You don't need a diagnosis or an IEP to use the ear protection, to use a wiggle cushion or things like that. Being flexible to people's needs, trusting that a child has, like, they don't necessarily have a perfect understanding of what's going on with them or what they need, but that they have something important and valuable to contribute, like coaching them on that self-management rather than just setting the expectations for them. So, for example, like, autistic people often need a lot more breaks. We get burned down much more quickly. I always say, like, I'm a sprinter, not a marathoner. Like, I can often get more done in 2 hours than most people can get done in 8 hours. But if I kept up that pace for 8 hours straight, just like my brain would melt. And so I call it a lot of times. I talk about like writing your own instruction manual, basically helping them figure out what works well for them, and then approaching from an attitude of not like, I know what's best for you and you should do what I say, but like, okay, if this is causing a problem, is there a different way to handle this that still meets your needs but is less disruptive? If they're asking for something that is just not viable, like, okay, it sounds like what you're proposing would be helpful to you. I'm not able to do what you're asking because I'm balancing all of these different needs that other people need as well. So let's brainstorm some other possibilities. And then helping, instead of just like shutting down what they think would be best for them, really helping them to explore, okay, like, you thought that you needed a day off just to play your games, to decompress and everything. And then you were saying, oh, after that, I'll be ready to come back to school. I'll be refreshed and able to participate like I'm expected. And then helping her look at, okay, did that do what you were expecting? Which sometimes it does. Sometimes that is what kids need, is just a chance to decompress. Or saying, okay, it's looking to me like you thought you were going to feel just ready to come back and do all your classwork and everything. But I'm noticing you actually seem to feel worse than ever now because you missed the lessons. You're stressed out about not understanding things. So let's think about some other possible approaches we might take when you're feeling overwhelmed. And so that, a collaborative approach for one of the things I say also is that like autistic people are often the canary in the coal mine, basically. So if they're doing poorly with something, it's probably not great for the neurotypicals either, but they're more able to power through. Like when you're working with neurotypical people, a collaborative approach is, probably going to get you much better results. It's probably going to be a good investment, but it's not necessarily as essential as when you're working with neurodivergent people. Because with neurodivergent people, often the collaborative approach it's more of a big investment up front. It can be tricky to find that time to do that, but you are often saving yourself so much time down the line in terms of, avoiding the challenging behavior or the school avoidance or all of those things.
That was a lot. That was a lot of good stuff. I'm excited to get some social media clips for that because that was a lot. It's stuff that people really need to hear though, because basically what you're saying is don't worry about whether this student, has a formal diagnosis or not. If you see that they have these needs, support them. Help them figure out what they need because they might not know. They're kids. They might not know. I mean, adults barely know sometimes. So Yeah, it's really like taking that approach of, this is an individual, and so do things that can support this individual. And what you said about the environment being better when it's collaborative for neurodivergent people as well, it just made me think about being at Social Cipher. And I believe at this point we're more than 50% neurodivergent staff. And so this environment compared to other work environments that I've been in are totally, totally different. And so when you said that, I was just like, yes, that explains so much, because it's just such a it's such a positive, environment to be in. And yeah, like that makes a lot of sense. I always learn so much from you whenever we talk. I really do. So I'm excited for everyone else to get to hear you share all of this knowledge. Okay, so now I want to know, what role can SEL play in supporting autistic girls? And for people who don't know, that's social and emotional learning, which is what Social Cipher creates curriculum and games about.
Yeah, that's great question. I think there's two kind of two main branches, I guess, more kind of the conventional social side, what we often think about when we hear social skills, in terms of like teaching them what is expected of them, what do people want them to be doing, and all of that. What is the norm for this kind of situation? And that's, you know, that's gotten a bad rap, and some of it is just deserved. A lot of social curriculums, unfortunately, have been very focused on like teaching that conformity and teaching do what people are expecting, regardless of whether that actually makes sense for you. But I think there are still things there that can be really valuable. Like I sat in on a social skills training, and I was a little nervous about, am I going to need to say like that I have concerns about what they're doing here? And at least the lesson that I was watching, they was teaching about body language. It was teaching about like in a group, how do you interpret if people are inviting you to join a group or not based on like how they turn their body. And I was like, wow, that actually would have been extremely helpful for me when I was that age. Like a lot of times I think I'm definitely looking at me. I think people looked at me and thought like, oh, this person is oblivious. Like they don't even understand that there's social norms and so on. And I remember even in college, like being in a room and being like, okay, I know that there is going to be a cue when I'm supposed to leave, and I have no idea how to look for it. Like there's all of these things happening. Like, is that the sign? Is that the sign? And I did sometimes end up like leaving prematurely because I didn't want to embarrass myself by missing the sign when you're supposed to. So that kind of thing can be very helpful, just decoding, having more information. And then there's the emotional side, which is, I think it is very important for these kids, and especially the girls who might be under more pressure to conform and please people and everything. The message that just because someone wants you to do something or be a certain way, like now you know what they want, but here's how you make a decision about whether you're actually going to do that or not. And so teaching the skills for self-awareness, for how do you like take care of yourself when you're surrounded by people who are not being supportive? How do you take care of yourself and meet your own needs or get them met somewhere else so that you're not needing to rely on these people? And then how do you communicate? Diplomatically, how do you self-advocate when it's a situation where you can work together and find something that's going to make everybody happy? And then how do you deal also when it is just not your problem? That, the person, it bugs them that you are, wearing cat ears to school or something. Like sometimes that's just not your problem, that they have an issue with that.
Yeah, that brings up a point that I thought about when you were speaking. But how do you, as the educator, how do you know the difference between supporting students in navigating a world that is not designed for neurodivergent students right now versus encouraging them to mask and camouflage?
I think a big part of it is going to be like, are you presenting this as like, this is a tool that you can use to get a certain outcome that you want, versus like, this is a moral obligation to like make sure that people, you know, aren't judging you or aren't judging you as being weird or what have you. I find, sometimes the social curriculums are, I think, hopefully they're trying to simplify it because they think kids can't understand the nuances. This isn't actually how they think about things, but like basically they'll just like straight up say that, it's bad to be doing something that's different from other people. And I think that's a huge problem. And so instead talking with them about, like, I remember I was talking to a friend who was dealing with people like being very judgmental of them. And I was like, okay, here is like what they're wanting you to do. Here's what you can do to try to get on their good side. And these are people you want to spend as little time with as possible. This person couldn't get away from them because it was at work. But like when you are needing to kind of compromise yourself in a way that's not healthy or constructive, like sometimes that is something that you need to do to get by, but keeping very clear on like, this is a survival strategy. It's not like something that's great for you to be doing in a vacuum.
Yeah, so it sounds pretty situational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one other thing I talked about, there's a book that's called Asper Kid's Secret Book of Social Rules that I feel like does a pretty nice job, for the most part, of kind of sorting out, okay, these are the things that are actually necessary in order to have like positive relationships and, caring about other people's feelings and so on in order to be respectful towards them. And these are the things that are kind of more of the social norms, and they're not actually important for having a healthy, respectful relationship. It's just kind of what, conventional social etiquette. But like one of the things I explain to people is I'm like, being somebody who is quirky, but, friendly and caring and likable, generally that person actually gets along much better than somebody who is fitting in, but kind of forgettable.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Definitely true. So, my last question. So, I know you work with a lot of parents of autistic students. So, what are some ways that you've seen schools successfully partner with them to support autistic girls?
Yeah, the partnership is such a huge thing. I'll tell schools the same thing that I tell parents, which is that when you are working with this, like the very first thing before you even get into like what should we do for the girl, it's really about needing to like uncover the person in the person. Like you come in, you're in these roles. You're in like the teacher role, the school administrator role, or you're in the parent role, fighting for my kid, advocate role. And so getting some kind of connection, like as people, building some trust that you're not, that you are going to be able to work towards finding something. I keep coming back. This is the whole collaborative proactive solution thing. I keep coming back towards, it's not about how do we get the other person to do what I want to be happening. It's about how do we get creative? How do we think outside the box to figure out something that is actually going to work for everybody? Because when there's troubles with the partnerships, I think there's two main things that can be going on. One is it's just combative up front. People are butting heads. They can't come to any sort of agreement. The other thing you might see sometimes is where the parents come in and you give them the plan. They're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I'm on board with that. And then they go home. They don't do it. They don't follow through. They don't back you up. And so for the first one, I think you need more like overt trust building. Again, going back to that, kind of the investment up front. When I was in school, I was a theater kid. I did a lot of the backstage stuff, set building and everything. So I always think about the saying like measure twice, cut once, because if you just make changes impulsively, or without really taking the time to make sure it's the right change, then you're going to end up just doing it over and over and over, and it actually ends up, wasting more time in the long run. Whereas if you invest some time in just kind of getting to know them as people, I was going to say letting them see that you respect them, but honestly, sometimes I think it is understandable when people are at odds. You might say like, oh, well, of course I respect them and everything, but you're not necessarily to be totally honest, you are not necessarily really feeling it. Like when somebody's frustrating with you and just seems to be making everything harder, then like in your heart, you might not actually be seeing like what there is to value and respect about this person. And so getting to know them enough to really be feeling that and come at it from that place, I think can be really valuable. And when you get the people where they're agreeable and they're saying, oh, this sounds great, and then they go home and they don't do it, then that's somewhere where you might need to be saying like, okay, like what might be the problems with implementing this plan? Like this is what we propose, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. Let's talk about how this might actually play out. Because a lot of parents, either they're scared of the school, they're scared they're going to get in trouble if they say, oh, this is going to work for us, or they genuinely believe like, well, I guess the school knows best. They're the experts, but then they go home and it just doesn't make any sense for how their family functions. So really, getting deeply into that, I think you can have the best plan in the world. I think about a family where like I was telling the mom, I was like, okay, I actually think the school they did a very good job of coming up with a great plan that's going to support your kid. They are not doing a good job of explaining to you why it's a good plan and helping you see that actually they are listening to you and they are taking your concerns into account. And this does address them, because mom was just feeling like, oh, they're not listening to me. They're not taking me seriously, when actually the school was taking it seriously and just not explaining that well to her, not helping her see that.
Yeah, so it sounds like that open communication is really the key to it. Like if they have that open communication, then the respect and the trust and all of that comes. And even if a plan doesn't work, the parents are like, okay, you still listen to us.
Yeah.
I know that you're trying. I know that you actually care, and it's a joint effort. And that is something that's missing in a lot of schools right now.
Yeah.
So I love that you're doing the work to help make those connections and help strengthen those relationships and, just help both sides understand each other and realize that they're both on the same side, which is the side of the student.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. There's really some wonderful, amazing schools. I've been so impressed with some of these. That's to see.
yeah, I'm sure that's refreshing. I'm sure that's super refreshing because the opposite exists so much. So that's good. I'm glad that you get that balance. But thank you so much for taking this time to talk and just share all of your valuable knowledge. I really, really appreciate it and can't wait for everybody to hear this.